Ask the Podcast Coach for July 16th, 2022.
Let's get ready to podcast.
There it is. It's that music. Hey, check the calendar. It is Saturday. It's time for Ask the Podcast Coach, where you get your podcast questions answered live. I'm Dave Jackson from the schoolofpodcasting.com, but that's not it. If you're watching this live, I just hit the wrong button. From the schoolofpodcasting.com, and joining me is not Jim Collison, but from bigpodcast.com, the very first man to put me on the radio many moons ago. He's got a background in all sorts of marketing, music marketing. He's dabbled in fashion industry, and he's been the author of many books. We're going to talk about these today. Of course, there's Big Podcast, and there's the new one, 101 Podcast Templates, and there's another one about publishing that I haven't got yet. It's the one and only David Hooper. David, how's it going, buddy?
Dave. Well, fashion. Let me be clear about that. What I was doing, I was working as an agent. We had Victoria's Secret was one of the clients, and my job was actually voiceover work for Victoria's Secret and other Les Wexner companies. You know, you're from Ohio, from Columbus, Ohio was where it was. So yeah, there was definitely fashion going on, but this is on video, so it wasn't me, and this is video proof.
But yeah, Jim is out on special assignment or something for his job. He contacted me. He's like, "Oh, I'm not going to be there Saturday." And you know, there are people that it's cool to have a David Hooper that you know, or I've had Matthew Passy on that you're like, you know what, this guy can just jump in and go to town.
How great is it to have guests that know how to use a mic? That's the great advantage of doing a podcast about podcasting. You don't have to explain things. You'd explain a little things to me. I don't normally do something like this, so this is new for me. But I'm, I know enough to click on a link, which some people surprisingly don't.
No, they don't. It's like, yeah, that link, click on that. But do you have anything to drink by chance?
You know, I've got something to drink, and this is funny because it is in a it's water, by the way, and it's in a Whataburger cup. Pedro Pena from My Stuttering Life is always teasing me about Whataburger, and we just had him in Nashville. He's like, "Man, I'm going to send you a Whataburger cup." I said, "Pedro, I'm vegetarian." But he did it anyway. So I'd never go to Whataburger, but I'm drinking water out of a spicy Whataburger cup.
Well, let me top you off here.
And it's a Yeti, by the way.
Excellent. And that pour is brought to you by our good friend Mark over at podcastbranding.co. I am rebuilding part of the School of Podcasting. And every time I upload my logo, I'm like, oh, that was money so well spent. If you need a lead magnet, if you need podcast artwork, if you need a whole new website, check it out, podcastbranding.co. That's my buddy Mark. He is not only a podcaster himself, he's an award-winning graphic artist. And what's different about Mark is, besides the fact that he's super talented, is he's going to sit down with you one-on-one, really figure out what your podcast is about, kind of the vibe that you want to put out there into the world, and make sure that your artwork or whatever it is he's doing matches what you're trying to do. So podcastbranding.co, go check out Mark, tell him that you heard about it on the Ask the Podcast Coach show, and he will definitely take care of you. This is so much better than some weird guy on Fiverr. Check it out, podcastbranding.co. And last but not least, Dan over at Based on a True Story podcast. If you see a show like, I don't know, Elvis is out there now with Tom Hanks, Dan might actually go and watch that movie and come back and go, okay, here's the deal. It's based on a true story, but they never did this, they never did that, and oh, by the way, they did this and that. And so he gives you all the scoop on what actually is true when it comes to those movies that start off with based. That's where it's based on a true story. So check it out. And Dan, thanks for sponsoring the mug there. So we appreciate that. And it's funny. We were talking beforehand, and there have been, I know there's podcast parties that Seth Reisler's has these little, to me, it's like the hallway at Podcast Movement, these little meetups, and they have, I've gone to one, I think it had 7 people. I had another one, there were about 30. And you were just win one from Jason Van Orden held one.
I did that. I did the last podcast party too. Yeah, I think they're, it's hit or miss, just like any kind of podcasting conference, but it only takes one really good connection and one good conversation to change something for you. So
yeah, I actually ended up getting a client out of one. I didn't really go in and that's the whole thing. I don't want to be that guy that's like, hey, it's all about me. It's all about me.
yeah, and that's what a lot of them are, honestly. I mean, you got to be prepared for that.
Yeah, I mean, you want to have your one-liner. You're like, hey, I'm Dave Jackson. I help people plan, launch, and grow their podcast, schoolofpodcasting.com. But I don't want to like just keep banging over people over the head with it. And that was enough to where somebody's like, hey, do you think you could help me do blah, blah, blah? And I was like, yes, I can. So that was, and then I said, I guess you ran into somebody who did 300 episodes.
Yeah, that was an interesting topic, I thought, maybe, in that he said, it was either guest or it was host. And it's sort of a matchmaking thing, or sometimes you're both. Like somebody like you or me, and we're both. And I was on there just to kind of get a vibe for it. And some guy said, yeah, I'm a guest. I've done 300 interviews. And right there, I'm thinking, okay, wait a minute. I don't care what you're talking about. That's what I'm interested in. How did you do 300 interviews? How did you set them up? What was the return on investment? And it's kind of controversial because there were a lot of hosts in there and there were a lot of other guests being like, dude, were you particular at all? Did you just say yes to anything?
Right.
And there's something to be said for that too, Dave, because if you're getting clear on your message or getting great with working under pressure or tech, doing 300, there's nothing like doing 300 interviews and having a lot go wrong that prepare you for that thing that you want to go right. Oprah, Joe Rogan, Howard Stern, whatever. I mean, you want to be prepared when you have a big opportunity. So there are advantages, but I thought it would be an interesting topic. Have you done 300 interviews, do you think, on the interviewee end?
I don't know if I've hit 300, probably close to it. And
Yeah.
I have one right now that I'm just getting, my spider senses are tingling that like, okay. And the guy wants to interview me because I'm an author. And what was interesting, and this is one thing you've done really well, is when you search for an image of David Hooper, there is one. There's one image, it's black and white, you sitting on some steps. I don't know how people, I remember one guy took a still of they stopped a video, and my mouth is half open, and they like took a screenshot of it. I was like, that's not really, like, can you use my I paid for.
I'll tell you how to do that just before we dive too deep into it. I've got an asset page, and I think that it's at bigpodcast.net, not .com, bigpodcast.net/assets. And I've got it set up where you can download it in any size you need. You tell it the size, and it makes you a custom size. I've got the logos there. I've got the podcast artwork there. I've got the book artwork there. It controls the message. And I think that's important because it's what you want to get out. I mean,
that's what I thought
I certainly don't want to screen cap from this interview here going out. This is not good lighting.
What was nice is we got it all scheduled, and he's like, hey, I've got I guess he builds a profile for each person on his website, and I look at it, and it even says, Dave has blah, 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 and so many downloads as of 2017. And then it lists a bunch of shows that I don't do anymore. And I was like, so I need to ask him, where did you get that information? Because unless he copied it from somebody else's website, I was this is all about dating.
Trace though, Dave, because one of the issues that you mentioned a couple of the books that I've done, and I've got other books that I would rather not talk about, and I'm not embarrassed about them. I'm just not talking about them now. And I think it's one of those things. It's almost like we're going to go behind the scenes. We're not connected to this call right before we went live. Dave is listening to this Canadian band called Triumph. I was like, is that Triumph? It's almost like one of those old school bands. And I've got an issue with this because I interview a lot of bands. Randy Bachman, Neil Headley would appreciate that I'm going to say his name right, but BTO, Bachman Turner Overdrive is the name you're going to want to talk to him about taking care of business, but he wants to talk about the new stuff. And balancing that out, I think it's an issue for anybody who's going to be on a podcast, and that would certainly be something you would run into if you're doing 300 episodes. They're going to find, somebody's going to go in and get your junior high photos and school record.
Well, the other thing I've run into, and I need to follow back with this one person, but it dawned on me it was a long interview, and about
how long is long?
We're like 45 minutes in of just like, since we hit we're starting now. Like there was like 5-10 minutes of cat talk, getting, and then we started, and we're like 40 minutes in, and I don't see any kind of wrap up coming anytime soon. And it dawns on me that really what this person wanted, because it was one of those people that we just interview interesting people. And all of a sudden it dawned on me, I'm like, this is free consulting. Like this person really just wanted to how do I grow my podcast? and I'm not complaining. It was, she was a great lady and we had fun, but it was just one of those where I was like, it's
Well,
just so.
it could be that, or it could be that somebody just thinks because they're involved that it's interesting. And I see a lot of that with I just talk to interesting people. Oh, really? What makes it interesting? Why would I be interested in it? We've got to think like that. We've got to think about our listeners and have a focused conversation. It's not even just a conversation, and people don't like to use the word interview. I don't know why, but
Yeah.
it does have to have a focused topic. Any conversation that you have is going to be focused.
Yeah, there's Eric Newsom in his book. He says if you're looking for a question, think about what is the one question that only the person in front of you can answer.
Right.
So like for you, I might go like, what was it like? This is like me bringing up taking care of business, but like, what was it like running a music conference? Cause that's one of the things you did in your background, but is there something that person can only answer? And I think what I'm starting to see at times is I heard a podcast this week and it was a bunch of guys talking about old metal, like 1980 stuff. And it's a great conversation and you're really into it because you're all about it, but you kind of forget that an audience is listening to this. And just because you find it,
was it multiple hosts? It was, what do you got? 5 guys, 1 brain kind of.
Yeah. But it was interesting. In fact, that it was, it's called Metal Mayhem. You're going to hear it on the podcast review show. And they did their homework and stuff like that. But really, if you think about like sports shows or anything where there's multiple hosts, usually it's almost not so much a debate, like a heated debate, but they even admitted, they were saying, hey, because they did a replay of 1984. And they're like, in 1984, this album was released. And then another big one was this album. And I said, you're kind of giving me it was about as entertaining as a LinkedIn bio. Like it's
just a list, it sounds like.
It was just a list. I got tell me what was your, like, if you only had to pick one song from that album, what would it be and why? And then they can like, what do you mean? It's got to be, Free Will Burning. It can't be, blah, blah, blah. Yeah.
Great album, by the way. Yeah. That was Defenders of the Faith by Judas Priest. Well, so here's the thing. One, I think if you're going to do 300 shows, let's say, as a guest, you got to bring the stories. You got to bring stories that are, bring yourself into it. Don't just be like, and then this album was released, and then this album was released. But the other thing that you've got to be good at, it's funny you mentioned the music conference. If you ask me about a music conference, I'm not going to necessarily hijack that in a bad way, but I'm going to be like Al Gore. And I'm going to shift it around what I want. And if you think about this, back when Al Gore was running for president, or he was promoting his movie about the environment, you could ask him a question. Hey, Al Gore, what about PMRC with Tipper Gore? What was that like back in 1985? So, well, we really need to talk about the amount of vinyl that was released that year and what an environmental mess that it was, which is why you're going to want to go see my movie. He'll bring it back to whatever he's doing. And I think you can do that skillfully while you're being nice to the host, but sometimes especially with 300 interviews, you're going to have to take control because frankly, there are just enough podcast hosts who haven't done the work. They haven't done their own 300 shows. Yeah. And what I started doing, because I used to say, look, I'll go on any show, whatever it is. How long did that last though?
A while.
Okay. Because it seems like a good idea.
Yeah. And then I found out that in some cases you have the person that's going to like, I'm going to wait until I get X amount of, shows ready, and then I'm going to launch them all at once. Well, they never make it to like, I want to have 15 shows ready. Your show number 7, they make it to 9 and quit. So it never even gets released. And then you have the person that I'm show number 3, they get to 7. This is too much work and they quit. Yeah.
Okay. So that's a rule. Is that your rule now, that it's got to be
released? Rule is you got to have at least 10.
Yeah.
Because they
already have to be out.
Yeah. Exactly. Because I used to literally spend, when you do an interview, there's the pre-interview, there's the interview, and in some cases, the post-interview is longer than the interview because you're having a good time talking with somebody. And
that's real time suck for me. That's where I get to where it's a lot of time invested on this. Yeah. So you look up and what was supposed to be a 20-minute interview took you through 3 hours. And I was like, I'm all right. I spent 3 hours and, it lasted, a month and a half online and now it's gone. And, so I just started saying, look, you got to have at least 10 unless I know you or something like that. So it's funny you say that because Mark Decote from podcastbranding.co. You mentioned him at the very top of the episode. I've done an interview with him. It was probably a month ago. It still has not been released. It has nothing to do with it not being released. It has to do with me getting ahead of time. Like, I can get you in, but it's going to be a minute. And that's another thing I think that people need to think about. If you're trying to hit the market right away, you're on the podcaster schedule. And the reality is sometimes stuff doesn't get released. And a lot of times stuff's going to be released 2 or 3 months later.
Yeah, it gets kind of tricky sometimes too. I have an interview with the guy from Stacking Benjamins.
Yeah, Joe Saul-Sehy.
But the other guy, the real OG. Yeah. And because he's got a book coming out, and he's got a really interesting, because of my podcast story, because he's a doctor. He was a hospice doctor. And I'm like, oh, dude, I can't imagine, just like, let me go to work and see who died today. I was like, Yeah. So, but he turned into this financial guy. So there's kind of a cool story there, but he's got a book coming out in August. So I've been sitting on this interview for like a month and a half, waiting for the book to,
the book.
Yeah. So, which is cool. It's given me time to really edit it. And I've been playing with,
and he's having to plan ahead himself, I would imagine, because he wants to have enough media that it all hits in August
at the same time. Yeah.
And you can't do it just because of what we're talking about, delays from the podcaster or just your own time schedule. I'm going to have to get him. I just had Joe Saul-Sehy, and those guys are great. They're doing something really amazing for a niche that's very crowded.
Well, how many podcasts do you have now? Because I know you started off with Red Podcast, then you had Big Podcast, and then you're doing a thing where you're kind of summarizing what's in your newsletter. Is that part of Big Podcast?
Yes, I've got a podcast called Build a Big Podcast. It's about podcasting, building an audience really is what it's about. And the newsletter issues are part of that feed. So I basically just add something so if you go to newsletter.bigpodcast.com, you'll see the written newsletter that goes out every week. But I've got an audio version of that because podcasters don't read. I found that out when I released that book.
Yeah, I was the guy that was complaining because I was listening to these episodes and I'd be like, hey, like, because I get it, you're driving people to your newsletter, but I was like, I'm not reading the newsletter. Like, where's the description and the show notes and things like that?
Oh, yeah. Okay, yeah. Well, that's a whole nother. We can get into that. Yeah, because then the episode notes are something different than the newsletter, and the episode notes drive people to the newsletter. Anyway, yeah, it gets confusing. But the number of podcasts. So I still do music business radio, which is technically it's a broadcast show, and that goes to podcast. Build a Big Podcast is my other one. Red was retired about 6 months ago. It just got to be you'll know this, Dave, because you started so many podcasts and finished so many podcasts. There's just not enough time to do all of them.
Yeah.
And the one you start is different than the one you end up with. And Red, I had started with my wife, and it was actually her podcast. I just was hanging out. She's like, oh, you're on the radio. You know what you're doing. I'm like, okay, cool. So it was never really what I wanted to do and never really what she wanted to do because it was a compromise. And then when she moved back into doing photography, she's like, I just, I've got no need to do Red. I kept it going solo for a while because really it's all about audience building for me. That's my thing. It's not podcasting per se. Podcasting is just the way we do it right now. But yeah, so I had to simplify, and I've got a daily thing that I just get behind the mic and just practice reading. It's a sausage factory podcast. That's what I call it. It's where I read, improvise, and think on my feet. And that's really preparing me for the real podcast for when I'm on the air or doing something like this.
Well, DR says, I'm reading the newsletter. I'm also listening to the Build a Big Podcast show. And basically I get so much info from both of them. So yeah.
Thank you. Well, I try to do something different. So it's almost like this one, Ask a Podcast Coach, or else what Ray does, Ray Ortega, where people bring in stories and you can add to them and vamp off them a little bit. So
we just we used to have topics. It'd be like, today we're going to talk about, microphones. And this week we're going to talk about book. And after a while, we're like, okay, well, we've kind of hit all the top 25. And that's when we just started vamping on the news and things of that nature. So
there's only so much you can say. Yeah.
Right.
There really is. But I think that's what separates like the journeyman podcaster like you compared to somebody who just got in. If you look at a brand new podcast consultant, for example, he'll say, plug a mic in. And Dave, so much more. I went to Dave the other day. I said, I got a PodTrack P4 and I'm not hearing myself. What's the deal? And Dave's like, did you flip the switch to USB? And it was a simple fix. I was like, oh, seriously? the design didn't make sense to me. And
Yeah.
that's only somebody like you who's been through those 300 interviews, if you will, and made the mistakes yourself that could give that advice.
I remember Matthew Dix, the guy that wrote Storyworthy.
Oh yeah, he's
And
got a new book out too. It's great. Yeah.
And I'd interviewed him, and he's like, hey, like, he goes, my wife and I do this, we can only hear ourselves out of one headphone speaker. And I go, oh, you're doing
on each side, probably.
Yeah. And I go, oh, you've got the wrong plug. You need this and that. He's like, wow, you're like, he goes, that's it. I go, pull that out. Is there 1 or 2 rings on it, or 2 or 3 rings? And he's like, 2. And I go, yeah, you need one with 3. And he goes, I think it was like, you're a ninja or something like that. And I was like, I've stubbed my toe on that one before.
Dude,
so
I mean, and that's the thing. We still make mistakes. I had the other day I was plugging in a mic. I'd switched out interfaces. Focusrite had sent me a Vocaster to test out. And I was switching it back, and my mic's not working all of a sudden. And what I later realized, it was a ATR 2100 that has the switch on it. My mic was off, but I never use a mic with a switch. And I've been using AT mics specifically for 30 years. And I was like, why did that? I thought it was broken.
What'd you think of the Vocaster?
I love it. I love those big ass knobs. I love the auto gain. I mean, I'm using a Focusrite Scarlett that I'm talking into now, but when you compare it to something like the P4, and I know you've got like the Rodecaster, the new Rodecaster, people overcomplicate things, and I love the simplicity of one big ass knob.
Yeah.
Do you want it louder or do you want it more quiet?
Well, and that if I have somebody that's like, I need something that's easy, and they're doing interviews, I'm like, okay, here, we're going to go Vocaster, we're going to go Squadcast, and while you do the interview, maybe throw it into Audacity or something, so you got 2 recordings going. Because that's my only biggest gripe is there's, it's not a recorder, but I'm like, there are ways to get 2 recordings going, at the same time.
I never used the reason that I have the PodTrack P4 was so I could tape phone calls and go onto the SD card. But other than that, I never use it. And it's for some specific stuff that I'm working on. It was for a very specific project where I needed to, it's kind of incognito taping phone calls. You know what I mean? Like, I don't want to make a big deal out of it and let people know that I'm taping. Which is legal in Tennessee, but by the way, that's not legal elsewhere.
Well, I was tempted because it runs on batteries. I live in Akron, Ohio. I've been trying to get a local Akron, Ohio podcast going, and I don't think I'm under curfew anymore, but we had a whole big, had riots and stuff. And I was going to go downtown and interview some rioters. And then I thought, I'm a middle-aged white guy. I may not be, and people are throwing bricks through windows. I'm like, maybe not.
Yeah, but dude, Dave, that's so much fun though. I mean, obviously it's really dangerous. I went to a Trump rally and did that, and I was. This was. I guess he was president, but he was still doing his rallies anyway.
Right.
And it can be dangerous. I almost got crushed. I got a little too close to a wall. I didn't want to become crushed. But but having some secret conversations. I mean, what great content is that? That's I probably wouldn't do anything where I could let anybody see a mic.
Well, that was the whole thing. And the thing I forgot, and it makes kind of no sense, is the fact that if you want to buy a short mic cable, they are 3 times as much as a 20-foot cable. Because I'm like, I just wanted like a 3-foot cable, so I'm not tripping over it. And I forget how much it was. And I was like, a 20-foot cable was like $7, and a 3-foot cable was like, almost 30. And I was like,
is it volume? Why is that? Like those monoprice ones? Is monoprice just cranking out 1,000,000 20-footers and 100,000 3-footers? Specialty product.
There we go. We're gonna get the chat room involved here.
Get 'em.
Somebody pick a number between 1 and 101.
Oh boy.
Because I'm holding the 101 podcast episode. Yeah. And there's about a 30-second delay, so it'll take a second to do that. If you are just joining us live, you're listening to Ask the Podcast Coach. We're at askthepodcastcoach.com/live. Jim is on special assignment. We got David Hooper from Big Podcast. All right. DR says 78. So I'm now going to go find 78. There's 80.
DR is working like the random number generator on Alexa that you
That's it. All right. So 78 is there's 79. And what's cool about, you know what this is? Can I say something that's a compliment that doesn't sound like a compliment?
Yeah, absolutely.
This is a great bathroom book. And what I mean by it is I look at this, and 78 is share your mistakes, and it is roughly 2 pages. So you can sit down, do your business, and learn a little podcast marketing. Put your index card in here for your bookmark, and you're good to go. I remember I forget what I wrote one time, and somebody I'll keep it clean, but they just said that's good pooping book, and I'm like, okay, thank you.
Should have printed it on 2-ply, Dave. It's one of those things that it's also a good trainer, Dave. If you wanted to go through that, and this is what I suggest people use it for, you don't have to pick all of them when you're doing your own podcast, but you will be a better host at the end of this if you start with one, go all the way to 101, and just try it. And nobody ever has to hear it. Just record it and say, what would it be like if I were to do this kind of podcast?
Yeah, I haven't read this cover to cover yet. I've kind of done what I'm doing here. And to me, I love tools that help me brainstorm by myself.
Right.
Because you go, oh, this is cool. Oh, you know what else you could do with that? And that's kind of thing. So,
well, you know what's surprising? I know I'm hijacking your interview, but
no,
this honestly, it kind of is like you talked about. It's almost like a long blog post. And I spent so much time on the first book. It's funny because a lot of people really like this book. This one is just kind of like, it's kind of like remnants. I'm just going to put this together. But I do think, honestly, to actually put it to use, and it's not just theory and not to go way deep and have you read like a 500-page book, this one is a whole lot more actionable. So I can see why people like it. And that's maybe a lesson in itself, that sometimes the content we put out, what we think is going to work, is the opposite of what people actually connect with.
Well, template 78 is share your mistakes. So
right, let's do it. Let's do it. Bring the chat room in this.
Yeah, there's one way of sharing your mistakes, but you can take this as far as you want. A variation of this is to make a segment where you share something you've recently done wrong. For example, if you podcast about personal finance, you could share how you screwed up your budget. If your podcast about relationships, you could share about how you got into a conflict with your spouse. And so, Dave, I'll let you explain. Why does that work?
People want to connect with you as a host and as a person. The problem is, as a host, you look at Dave Jackson, you say, well, Dave's done 28,000 podcasts, and I can't possibly relate to him. But by telling that story, like I told a minute ago, like I left the on and off switch. That is like the most basic mistake you could make. And it still happens after working with microphones 30 years. I think it humanizes you, it connects you to somebody, and it makes it where you're approachable. And approachability is one of the best things that you can do. If you think about the celebrities that you love, the ones that we like are not the ones that we think we're going to get slapped in the face if we go up to them and ask for an autograph. So this helps with approachability, it helps humanize you, and it shows that you're like your audience, but at the same time, you're inspiring your audience because, one, you got the guts to say something about it, but also you got over it.
Yeah, I just one time did it as like a joke. It'll be fun. And I put, for lack of a better phrase, bloopers at the end of my show. And I had somebody email me, and they said, I'm so glad you did this, because this whole time I thought you were, basically this robot. Yeah. And I was like, no, not at all. I said, and those are just some of them. I said, there are times my mouth just does not want to cooperate. I said, I know exactly what I'm going to say. I just can't get it out of my mouth. And they're like, oh, thank you so much for that. And so exactly that will,
well, that happened with Casey Kasem. We've all heard the Casey Kasem bloopers. Anybody in radio or podcasting where you're coming out of a death dedication, this upbeat number, that humanized him. It was also pretty raw at the time because we've got this classic voice that we've heard, and we've only heard it in certain situations, but it ended up helping him out. And really, I talk about that in the upcoming book about the great lessons from Casey Kasem, and he made a lot of mistakes in his career, but he also did a lot of things right.
Yeah. Well, the next book is the new one out. The launching your podcast.
The planner is supposed to be out in September, but kind of like those podcasts that are supposed to be released. We'll see. Definitely by October. You can pre-order it now on Amazon.
Your new nickname is going to be David, the Stephen King of podcasting Hooper. Because you guys don't realize this, but right now, by the end of the show, Dave is going to have another book ready. He's like, where did you find time to write all these?
I have the next 12 laid out, actually, speaking of this.
Wow.
And the time is just, butt in chair. I'll call it like that. It's just sitting down to do it. I've got a lot of ideas, but it's putting them together. It's not any different than a podcast, honestly.
Well, yeah.
But,
And so to that person, because I know a lot of people that want to write a book, and somebody was asking me about it. I said, my biggest thing was exactly what you just said, getting my butt in the chair. Because I could tell when I don't want to do something because I end up in the kitchen for no apparent reason.
Oh, dude, I start cleaning. My wife knows what are you procrastinating? Because the house looks great. The yard looks fantastic.
But once I sat down and started writing, then I ran into a different problem where now the creative juices are flowing. And I'm looking up, I'm like, it's 1:30. I should probably go to bed, but I just want to keep going and going and going. So I think
it's hard, man. I think
how do you get yourself in the chair?
I do a thing. There's a thing called caveday.org, which is more or less it's Pomodoro. So it's I'm not going to an office now or anything. I'm still concerned about, COVID's still a thing, and I don't necessarily like people around, but I like having other people there. So basically what you do is on Cave Day, you get on at a certain time. There's other people that are on there, and people watch you work. They take a break every hour, and it's basically the Pomodoro method. So you're working 55 minutes or so, double Pomodoros. And then you take about a 5-minute break, and then you get back in the chair and you do it again. And with that said, Dave, I've only got maybe a good 2 or 3 hours of writing in me a day. That's on a good day. The most I've ever done is 6. And that's when the project is at the very beginning. And there's sometimes when I've got to step back and take a month or 2 off sometimes and not touch it, because it's hard, man. It's like there's I don't know how to say it. It's like I think it'd be like doing a documentary, maybe, is the closest thing to podcasting. Sometimes you just get so overwhelmed with ideas, and the pieces all have to fit together. And then we can talk about like the judgment that you get, like your 2-ply toilet paper book that you released, Dave. Whatever, you're opening yourself up to comments, and you're opening yourself. You want it to be good, but the reality is that it's just it is what it is. That's from my experience.
Well, I've read back when I was in the music scene, you had one about how to make X amount of money, $10,000, I think it was, and
it was 100,000. I had a guy 100,000. I was a co-author on it. Yeah, and that was actually the review. Speaking of funny reviews, it's a joke, just like David Hooper himself, which at the time,
jeez,
yeah, it was harsh. It's still up on Amazon, but it hurt at the time, and now it's funny. I can pull it up and joke around about it here and put it on my slides, but
you remember it. That's the interesting thing.
Yeah.
Like now,
I think that might have been the first one, but that's where I was, though. I think it's like your first podcast. I had a funny meme the other day. If you're interested in some funny podcasting memes, Big Podcast 1 is a username on Instagram. And it said, this is how my first podcast, this image looks like my first podcast sounded. And it kind of had a Napoleon Dynamite in like a karate uniform. It's like, you thought you were cool, but and that's kind of how the first book is. I think with our podcast or with any creative thing that we do, you've got to get in there and mess it up, man. There's no way around it. We all think we're going to be Casey Kasem, but Casey
Kasem.
Yeah.
Hey, Coach David asked us a little bit ago, because you brought up it was bigpodcast.net/something to control your.
I think it's assets. Bigpodcast.net/assets. ASSETTS. Is that how you spell asset? See, hard to believe I could do a book.
All right.
So that's a newsletter.
Bigpodcast.net/asset. Survey says.
I think that's it. What is that? 404.
Maybe not.
Is it asset or assets? Big podcast. Yeah, I've got an assets page, and more or less it has all sorts of control.
Part of this is here. The other problem is we're relying on Dave to type things correctly, and that's not going to work. But anyway,
I'll see if I can pull this up on my phone. I've got my phone here, and I'll get that link to you.
There we go.
But did you get it?
I did not. No.
Okay. So
bigpodcast.net/assets. This is what we call an edit point.
Oh, is it? Yeah,
you won't hear this. Well, this is what this is. This is the new media show. When I hear Todd and Rob doing, Todd will be like, all right, I think it's assets. Wait, it's to carry the TY. Big podcast.
Well, this is like my daily Sausage Factory podcast because I read names and birth dates a lot of times. It's just episode prep. That's a lot of times how I start.
Yeah.
And it'll say something like, the guy who played Tattoo on Fantasy Island is
Hervé Village.
Yeah, well, right. It'll be like he would have been 80,000 years old today. I was like, man, I wonder what IMDb says about that guy. Then I got to pull it up, and
there you go.
So well. So bigpodcast.com/assets. Let's see if I can pull this up here.
Is it? See, maybe that's
who knows. I've got a page that is only we'll call it approved images. And this is really nice if you ever do any kind of like major media. Like I know that with Music Business Radio, we have to make sure that we've got clearance on the photos that we have.
Yeah.
But it also allows you, if I want a 500 by 500 image, I can get it from there. If I want a JPEG, it converts everything automatically. And it's got the official logo. It's got, I mean, you could get really specific and say, I've got a specific blue for Podcast Coach blue that I need. Dave Jackson only wants this blue. It can't be that blue. It needs to be this one, just like Facebook blue. So you can get real specific about how you want to come off as. And I think that's important if you can control stuff and make it easier for people, that can be really handy. But you could do this on your own. You could just basically have a official photos page, almost like it might still be up there. It's interviewdavid.com for people who wanted to interview me. I think I've removed it. I don't think it's active right now, but it has everything you need to know about interviewing me.
Well, I know I just created, I've had it, but I made a pretty link for it. I think it's schoolofpodcasting.com/press kit. And there's a PDF of my bio, my headshot, logos. It's a folder.
Okay. I'm glad you mentioned that because on the assets page, I've got basically bullet points. Like if you get lost, here's some things that you can ask me. Here's my 3-sentence introduction. Here's the full intro. Here's the bio. Yeah, all that stuff is fantastic because a lot of times people do not do their research. And the issue that you would have, Dave, or I would have, would be like, well, David Hooper, he wrote a book called $100,000 Musician. And here we are, we're going to talk about music. I was like, oh God, I've been in situations like that. It's like, I don't want to talk about music anymore.
Right.
I want to talk about podcasting and some general stuff, but they find something that was from 1995 on the internet and they still think I'm doing it.
Well, I always love when they go, what would you like to talk about? And I'm like, you asked me, like, what do you want to talk about? But
my blood pressure is getting higher right now from you saying that, Dave.
When you go to schoolofpodcasting.com/press kit, you'll see there's my bio, which is just exactly what Dave said. You've got my short bio, my long bio, except it's making me download the PDF. Couple headshots. It gives
specific questions and also bullet points.
Yeah.
Like I had some stuff, like one of the things that I've done that I can bring back to podcasting is I work for Miss Cleo, call me now, that woman.
Oh yeah. I remember Miss Cleo.
Victoria's Secret thing. You're talking about fashion industry. I don't know if that's where you got that. Or
I just remember, I mean, I've listened to your show and I remember you've, the occasion you'll mention that you had a client that was in the fashion industry and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, so I threw that in there for fun.
Yeah. Wexner up in Ohio. That was everybody. It sounds really sexy, but it's not. But that's kind of I could turn that into a thing. I could say, well, it sounds really sexy, Dave, to think that you worked with Victoria's Secret models. But let me tell you this, Dave. Those girls are just like the rest of us. They're getting judged all the time. You're too fat, skinny, tall, short, black, white, just like us as podcasters, Dave. And speaking of non-sexy, look at this. I'm in a closet. It's 5 by 8, 40 square feet. I tricked it out. I put some foam in it. But it sounds great when you hear the final sound. It's like, there's ways to do that. And I thought of topics like that and I basically put it in a PDF. So it kind of has like I tried out for VeggieTales, the talking carrots and that kind of thing. That's a funny story. But there's things like that you can do. You give them to a host and that host helps you to control your message that you want out there. But it's not so much like, here are the questions and here's the bio and here's 10 questions. Because a lot of times what you'll have is a host that'll pull a John Lee Dumas. And they'll just read the questions and then what? And then what? And then what?
Man.
And you can do that. But the issue is if you've got a fan and they listen to the more than one interview, you're going to turn your fan off. Dave, I heard you mention this. We we're naming names, right? Why not?
We're
Okay.
naming names.
Michael Hyatt. I heard you mention this when I was doing my prep for this show. You talked about Michael Hyatt. You said, "Man, this guy's everywhere, and I really like him." But the question was, can you be overexposed? And you made the point that a lot of people want to interview Michael Hyatt, and they ask the same questions. And I don't know if that's Michael Hyatt's doing, or because we get into the point where you've done hundreds of interviews, that a lot of episode prep that we do as host is from the previous interviews, and it's just a lazy host. Like, "Oh, I'll just steal these questions, and I know where he's going to go," and then the whole thing it cycles upon itself, and you just get more of that, and it comes in as a one-dimensional interview that's done like 80,000 times.
Yeah, Michael Hyatt is a guy that this is where we talk about if you ever want to change your topic or mess with your podcast. I loved his original podcast. It was him,
Solo podcast.
his solo podcast talking about marketing and content, and it was great. And then he switched to a co-host who would then interview him. And it went from this wise sage giving me, advice on how to make better podcast to now I'm sitting watching two people talk. It was still good content, but it wasn't quite the same. And then I'm not sure why, because I still love his book. It's called Platform Get Noticed in a Noisy World. And I used to read that once every year. I would yeah. And then he kind of became the productivity guy.
Yeah.
And he even said like he wasn't comfortable doing a solo show. And he just, for whatever reason, he was like, yeah, I'm kind of done with the productivity or the content stuff. He wanted to be known as a productivity guy. And, every November it's Michael Hyatt season because he's talking about how you can have your best year ever.
They pull him
and
out.
I was like,
they bring out like the fitness guy getting ready for the New Year's goals. And
and I was always like, oh, cool. I love Michael Hyatt. And then it would be him talking about, again, productivity, having your best year, but that's not really what I want to hear Michael talk about. And that's not, Michael doesn't want to talk about anymore what I want to talk about.
Well, Michael Hyatt is in a business of selling planners. So if you think about that, he's going to put you on a subscription for every 3 months. You're going to get a planner to plan your life out. And if you're in that business, you obviously want to talk about that. But I think, it's an issue of, in a way it's controlling the message, but maybe it's controlling the message a little too much. But I hear you on the co-host thing. In some ways, co-hosting is great. This is fantastic, Dave. And somebody is more likely to listen to you and me than they would be just to me as a solo podcast or you as a solo podcast. That's one of the reasons why interview and co-hosted format podcasts get more downloads than a solo monologue show. But at the same time, you've got to have the great people. And you know this because I've heard you talk about Jim Cullison, that Jim is your guy. So when you bring me in here, it's a different energy, and you and Jim can read each other like you can read each other in a band. You kind of know where you're going, and it's like a well-worn pair of jeans. That's really nice, but you've got to set that up. And I'm not sure with Michael's new podcast, part of it is that I think he brought in his daughter, and that's, look, I get it. You're related to her, but is she the best person for the job? I'm not making any, I don't listen to that podcast, but I
that's
think
me.
That's like me doing a podcast with my wife. She didn't want to be there. And she's in the house, but is she the best person to do a podcast with?
Well, I used to listen to Michael Hyatt. And again, I'm not saying Michael is bad. I'm saying Michael switched gears. He pivoted, and I'm no longer his target audience. And I'm sure he's doing great in the productivity space. And Ray Edwards was another wise, sage guy that used to talk to me directly. And for a while, he brought his son on. And what was interesting is they were obviously batch recording these, and they would do callbacks to something that to them was like 10 minutes ago, but in reality, it was 3 episodes ago.
Yeah. Remember that?
And they're, because they'd be like, oh, you owe me $20. And I'm like, why does he owe you $20? What? I didn't make. So I think the son has now gone off to do whatever he's doing. But I saw those two guys as maybe trying to set their family up to take over the family business.
So all right, let's talk about another financial guy who is in Nashville. Dave Ramsey's doing the same thing.
I love Dave Ramsey.
And Dave understands. Dave's probably 65 years old now. He is not an idiot, but he is the force driving that company. He doesn't really trust people. You can look at the people that he has fired, that he's tried to bring in. It's like it hasn't worked out for him, right? The last guy, they just excommunicated. Have you seen that when they fire somebody from Dave Ramsey? It's like a hostage video where you're like, I have gone against the Ramsey credo and will be retiring. And Dave got like a gun on the other side of the camera. You're gonna do it.
You're
Anyway,
gonna read the card.
And he's bringing in his family, and they probably wanted they're like, "Oh god, do we have to talk about baby steps? I've been listening to this growing up at the dinner table." But that's the only people that he trusts. And I think it's something for us to ask as podcast host. It's like, we do it with friends, like, "Oh, man, I've got a friend." That can strain your relationship. It can certainly strain a personal Dave, you've done podcasts with people you've been married to. And
yeah, that didn't work out well.
But you know what I mean? It's like, sometimes we don't always bring in the best people.
Right.
Regardless of what reason that is. And what you're saying is true too. I mean, it's, we're unpacking a lot of stuff and we can do it. It's like, what happens when you get sick of talking about a topic and you want to pivot? I was in the music business for 20 years and I said, how am I going to get out of this? I was done with it, but I've got so much volume of stuff and I've still got a radio show and people know me as the music business guy. Some people do, not everybody now, not people in this world.
But you did a nice transition because you were like the music marketing guy. And then you went to like, okay, let's talk general marketing with a little bit of music in there. So now we're doing marketing. And all of a sudden there was a time when you're talking a little music marketing, a lot of general marketing. Oh, and then there's this new podcast thing. And then you just slowly like, okay, now we're not going to talk much about music. Now we're going to talk general marketing.
Well, that's because I didn't know where I was going to go. If we're honest, I was like, I'm sick of making stupid people famous. I've done it. I felt like I was working in a factory.
Yeah.
And so I didn't know where I was going to go. Like, but it looks like it was genius now because you're like, okay, it's still audience building, it's still spreading your message or whatever.
Yeah.
But the actual plan, when I got to Red, like I said, that was Laurel's podcast.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, I'll come on. And we did it over dinner. We're like, okay, Red, real entrepreneur development. That sounds great. Didn't really test it out, and I tried to make it what it was. But what my plan was is I was going to do 3 books. I was going to do a podcasting book. I was going to do a book about live events because I've produced 1,200 or so live events. I've done a lot of them, and I know about that from the music industry. And I was going to do a book about books, about how you can package yourself using radio, books, and live events to be your own whatever guru if you want to. You know, I like the podcasting thing so much. I just doubled down on it. I just went in, just never got into the other ones.
Since you brought up that question, I'm gonna. This was a question that somebody sent in, and I don't know why this is. You ever have one of those days when technology is just not your friend? Here we go.
Every day.
This is from. Actually, he's in the chat room. There you go, Andreas. We're doing your question.
Yeah.
He asked this, and this is where I got this. I don't normally do this, but after doing this, I might do this. He threw this in the chat a couple weeks ago, and I was watching the chat and I was like, oh, we never answered his question. So I pulled it out and put it here. So he says, do you think any podcast can be turned into a book, or would it be better to write a book and then use it to create content? Ooh, well, that is kind of a good question.
You could do either one. And I think that, well, let's say, so he is, and I'm sorry, I read that it's Andreas is how we say his name.
That's how I'm saying it. So I don't know if that's correct.
If we're messing up your name, let us know in the chat because I've been wondering. I was going to do a podcast. He asked me why don't I mention music anymore. What I try to do is I try to bring in those stories from the music business and make them podcasting related. So when you think about that, when you're coming out with a book, can any podcast or any experience be made into a book? The answer is yes, but it has to have that topic that Dave and I talked about earlier. With an interview, it has to have a focus. It can't just be like a general book. Like a general marketing book is going to get lost. So you need to bring in your experience, just like you would with a podcast. And what I realized, and why I started doubling down, I still tell these Casey Kasem stories, music business stories, that kind of thing, is because it brings in like a little bit of flair that nobody else has. And I know a lot of stuff. Like when Dave was playing that Triumph song, how many people would have logged into your chat, Dave? Is that Triumph? Or is that Fight the Good Fight? It's like, you know what I mean? It's like, this is a 1980s Canadian metal band. And I'm trying to bring something that nobody else can bring to the table. And I think everybody's got that. It's not just me. It's just, we've all got our life experiences, and let's do it. Not get into failure porn or something like that, but bring in, it's almost like a unique combination. It's like, I have music and I'm a liberal guy who grew up, my first job was working gun shows, and I have experience behind a mic. So how can I put these things together and talk about whatever, like what's that unique combination that I bring to the table.
That's it. What makes you, because I hear so many shows, and if you're doing this show, by all means, if you're having fun, do it. But when I hear I'm interviewing interesting people with interesting stories to empower and inspire.
Yes. I just want to motivate people, Dave.
Yeah. But the thing I'm thinking that we're missing is so that you can, like, what's in it? Like, I understand that the listener's going to be inspired and empowered and motivated so they can blank. Because if you added that, so that you can be a better cyclist, so that you can be a better parent, so that you can be, but if it's just like, hey, that was a great story, I'm empowered and inspired. And again, nothing wrong with that. I think I'm weird. I don't need inspired or empowered. I get inspired.
Don't need motivation and inspiration. Yeah. And the reality is, when you're writing that book, for example, when it's you with your butt in the chair, it's still just you and your butt in the chair. Dave's not here, and it doesn't matter that Dave has done it. It matters, can I do it? So I don't know that people need motivation, inspiration. I think that we've got it. I think there's other things that are standing in our way. And
Dave's not here, man. So that's a really old reference. You know what inspires me, Dave?
But Dave, you know that though. You know that. And I think for somebody who's, in our age group, middle age, I hope it's middle age. Hope I'm not on the final 15 minutes.
The back nine, yeah.
Right, back nine, baby. But I think though, people say, like, you and I know Zeta Christian. So Zeta Christian's 74 years old right now. And look, let's make age that thing. We'll call you the oldest podcaster that there is. The oldest podcast,
she's up there.
Let's emphasize that, because there are a lot of people. This is what I learned in the music industry, like all these folkies that we put on the road. They're just, man, there's just nothing for me anymore. Everybody just wants to be, young country. But the hell, there's not. There's still 50-year-olds going out to shows, and they don't want to get drunk and get on pedal taverns and whatever. I mean, there is a place for you, and I think that's the great thing about podcasting. So let's emphasize that. If you're older, if you've got some kind of specific thing, do it.
Yeah. My brother
but yeah, it could be, you could do this to a book too, to take it back to Andre's question.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the thing, and Dave, you can probably agree with this. The fun thing about writing a book, you think the hard part is writing the book, and it's not easy. But for me, at least, the hard part of a book is, it's like a podcast. You record the podcast. Now I got to get people to listen to it. With a book, okay, the book is done. You're like, all right, that's done. You're like, nope, now you got to get people to read it. And
there's that, and there's a lot of podcasting parallels. The podcast you start is not the one you end up with. The book you start, definitely not the one that you end up with. And you've got to get good at editing. This is one of the podcasting skills that will help you to do a book. If you've already got a podcast, I hope you're good at editing by now. You should be editing. But that the big podcast book, which is 93,000 words, I think it was eventually it was 120,000 words. I had to cut 25,000 words out of it. Yeah, it's big.
It is a big book.
Yeah.
Now the new one's not a pamphlet by any means, but you can see where the new one is whole. I keep it by my bed that way in case somebody breaks in. I just, it's a weapon as well.
When I had to record the audiobook, I was like, oh, thank God, because talk about something that's a hard part of the process. You would think podcasters would be great at doing audiobooks. The problem is, I'm so used to my skill is looking at notes and taking a sentence and riffing on it. I have a hard time sticking to the script for 10 hours.
Yeah. I started recording my audiobook, and that was the first thing I said. I said, I'm going to, I'm basing this on the book, but I just decided I was going to do the Gary V. I don't know if you've ever listened to.
Okay. See, but that's perfect though. That's you bringing your personality to it. And that's what we all need to be doing. There's nothing wrong with that, as long as it's organized.
Yeah. Cause Gary V, if you listen to, I think it's punch, jab, something, whatever it was. And he is almost off script more than he's on.
Yeah.
Cause that was the first time I ever got into Gary V, and he's like halfway through his first chapter. And he's like, all right, hold on, because a lot's changed since I wrote this. And I was like, wait, what? What is he doing? And he's like, all right, let's get back to the book. Kevin Hart is another guy. He wrote a book that is just hilarious because he's just cracking jokes. He's making fun of himself as he's reading his own book. So,
well, that's something I used to love about your podcast is you would interrupt interviews after the fact during the edit. it was like snarky Dave would come in. I was like, "Oh god, this guy, this is hilarious." And I've never seen anybody do that, but I think, like, if we can all find our own version of that, like, people,
Yeah.
one of the things that is most popular about my audiobook, I've had so many people comment like, "Man, it's hilarious how you laugh at your own jokes." So, I just left him in, I just left
Yeah.
the laughter in because we talk about bringing that humanity to people. You don't wanna be that polished guy. Like, I've had other audiobooks that I've had other people voice, and they're like,
Yeah.
"Hello, this is the book by David Hooper. Tantor Media presents." It's like
Yeah.
that kinda thing. It's like, "Oh god, let's bring personality to it," and that's what we have the opportunity to do, and anything that we do with podcasting, and that's coming in with your background, the combination of your background. If you're snarky like Dave and you wanna interrupt those interviews after the fact, you need to do that more often, Dave. That was so fun.
It's funny when you said that, I was like, yeah, I haven't done that in a while.
I
Usually
know,
what it
I know.
was me. I just want to make sure that the audience heard what I heard. Like somebody would just drop some gold and I'd be like, oh, did you hear what they just like? This is what it was. Okay, back to the interview kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize it at the time till later that like you're not supposed to do that. Like, don't make it all about you and blah blah blah. And it's
Well,
like it's rude to interrupt the flow. And I was like, I'm just trying to help people make sure they didn't miss the point.
I talk about this, and this is hilarious 'cause we had this conversation before we got on, but, this is in my book, Chet Atkins. Chet
Mm,
Atkins could play 2 guitar parts at once, and the
yes.
reason he does that is because he was listening to 2 guitarists that he thought was 1 guitarist. You mentioned the song that you thought it was 1 guitarist, but it's actually 2 guitarists as well, Dave, because you just heard the album,
Yeah.
and it's like we are hearing this stuff, and sometimes not having all that information can lead to great innovation, and I love it that you did it, didn't know you weren't supposed to do it, and you still did it. That's why there are no hard and fast rules, but at the same time, the best practices that you talk about. And I think that, common sense comes in there, but also let's make it fun. You're not gonna mess it up.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, well,
But
maybe, within reason.
yeah,
Some people
yeah.
it's a bigger
There's always a
mistake though for
first.
you to well, but it's a bigger mistake for you to be boring and just
Yeah,
copy the exact same thing and say, "I'm gonna interview exciting entrepreneurs." Like, yeah, you and the last 10 people I talked about in this networking group. Great.
yeah,
You got pregnant as a teenager. Okay, yeah, half of America did, It's like that's not sometimes what we think about, it's like I talked about the book, sometimes why people like a book is not why I thought they would like the book, and sometimes what people like about us is not what we would think that it is or hate about
yeah.
us. Oh, they'll
Yeah.
love me that I'm rich. I'm just inspiring people.
Well, speaking of the book, there it is. Again, you can find Dave at bigpodcast.com. And we do want to take a second to thank our awesome supporters. Except I think I uploaded the wrong. I did. I uploaded the wrong slide. This is what we call edit point 2, Dave, where you go, oh, I forgot to upload the thing. This is what I want. This is who I want to thank. My awesome supporters. There we go. So I want to take a second to thank my awesome supporters. If you'd like to be an awesome supporter, go over to askthepodcastcoach.com/support. And people like James over at the Dog Podcast. Nope, that's not it. Although you did say that. Dave just said this, so we'll let Glenn sneak in here.
Don't be boring.
And you know who's not boring? James over at the Dog Podcast Network. Dave, you have 1, 2 dogs. How many dogs you got going now?
Got 1 dog. Yeah.
All right.
Parker.
So
Parker
if
the
you need
dog.
something, to listen to while you're walking Parker around the block, go over to the Dog Podcast Network. They've got short shows and long shows, and everything dog is there at dogpodcastnetwork.com. And Ask the Podcast Coach runs on Podpage. If the last website I made using this, it took me 10 minutes and I was done. It was awesome.
Great.
Check it out.
Yep.
Try podpage.com. Jim's not here. Jim's not here, man. If you need more Jim, go to theaverageguy.tv and check out his back catalog. And when you think podcasting, think School of Podcasting. And again, if you'd like to be an awesome supporter, go over to askthepodcastcoach.com/support. So, and this is where I normally have a thing ready to go, except I don't.
Well, how fun is live radio though and live broadcasting because of that?
Well, that's
I
I guess
you
that's
got to be prepared, but sometimes these little mistakes, it's you're showing your humanity, Dave.
there. Is that
Like
what I'm
is
doing?
asset 1T or 2?
Yeah. Here's one. Well, here we can show this. You haven't seen this yet, probably. Speaking of sharing my screen on a audio podcast. This is
I'll describe it.
yeah, I will. I don't know. Every time I go share my screen, I have to share it twice today for some reason. Things are being a little weird. This is podcaststudiopro.com. It's from a guy, and it looks a lot like Trello. But what I use it for is we're looking at the notes section. And so today we took Andres's question here. And if I put down episodes, I don't know what episode we're on, but we'll say we're on episode 4. I can just drag this over to episode 4, hold my mouse over it, and just say, yep, we use that question. So it's
you're using this to plan out this episode.
Yeah. So I've got a bunch of things here that we could talk about. That's when I said, I normally have something here. And I was like, I need to fire up my Podcast Studio Pro. So
this thing is, he sent me a copy of it. And this is like, if you're familiar with doing note cards to plan out a book or to plan out a commercial, what we call maybe a treatment. If you're trying to sell something, say, this is what it's going to be, you're going to go to this. And it's very cool. I think that it would be really, it's great for, like, I always use like an outliner, like Omni Outline to do my episodes because I'm just working from bullet points. But if you were to do something like a documentary, I think this is fantastic. If where the narrator comes in here and does this, I mean, because you can color code everything. You can have multiple people look at something. It's almost like being in a writer's room for a sitcom or whatever. I'm sure Saturday Night Live, they're starting the week out doing something just like this.
Well, that's actually where it came from. The original version of this was, I think, Writer's Room Pro. Yeah. And this guy's in New York, and he has shows that you've heard of that use that to plan their show, and he just took it and turned it into a podcast thing. So I've been playing with it. For me, especially like my Akron podcast, I'll take a couple news spots and put it in the notes section, and then when it's ready to do an episode, I look at the notes, and if I still find it interesting, then I'll throw it into the podcast.
See, that's what I do with my newsletter. I've got basically like a big bucket. When I see something, I clip it. I've got in the bucket, okay, the new newsletter is going to come out, and I just basically look through it and I try to add commentary to it. I think that kind of thing is super helpful. Some of Evernote does it. A lot of different web clippers out there that'll do it. And then if you can organize on top of that, it's amazing.
We do have a question in the chat room. Kevin is asking, discuss the differences in the Rodecaster 1 versus Rodecaster 2. I've actually got a video on that on my YouTube channel. Here's the thing. This is one of those hard questions to ask, because if somebody says, is it worth it? Well, it's $700. How much is it going to hurt for you to spend $700? If you're like, I got that in my couch cushions right here. I don't know why that person's Southern, but he always is.
Cool. Well, come on.
Yeah, because that guy's rich. He's in oil. That's what it is. It's an oil guy.
Well, we also spend money on stupid stuff down here. So, yeah. Not the Rocasters. But, hey, is Rocaster 1 still available, though, Dave? Or is
it is. And it's
so you can get either one of these. You can decide 1 or 2.
Yeah. And so for me, the 1 wasn't bad. I didn't even I think I finally used a cloud lifter, but that's because I got the SM7B. When I wasn't using the SM7B, it worked fine. Yeah. Most of us don't need the fun little, sound effects. If you're doing live streaming, okay, maybe, but it's just one of those things where, is the 2 so much better that I need to drop it?
I don't even know that you even need the 1 for most people. I think that if you're doing a solo podcast, like I'm going into a Focus Scarlett. Well, I can tell you the whole chain. 1, I'm going into a cloud lifter to give it a boost. I've got an AT20 BP40 mic, which is the Audio-Technica broadcast mic. I'm going into a DBX 286. Goes into the Scarlett, goes straight into a computer. There are no fancy buttons. There's a compression. There's a noise gate. There's that kind of thing. But to me, all the bells and whistles of the Rodecaster Pro. How much is the Rodecaster Pro?
$700. The first one is, I believe, now $600.
So the stuff that I mentioned is probably $700 combined. Maybe it's a little over. It could be closer to $1,000. But that's got a broadcast quality mic. That's got the compression. I don't know that most people need it. Is my point. Yeah, because like those sound pads and stuff. I mean, how do you even use it, Dave? Use it for live streaming?
I use it for, like, right now we've got our music. Right, we've got the coffee pour, we've got the music, we've got Glenn.
Don't be boring.
Right,
nobody punch you in the face. Got some of those.
Yeah, it's probably in here too. if I run across somebody, if somebody brings up Anchor, it's going to be.
And now it's time for a power rant.
So I've got a couple of those.
For streaming, it's great, and it probably helps with editing. But the problem is with anything that you're going to put on tape, it's there permanently, and if it comes on too loud, you might have to put it in
like
again.
That just did. Yeah.
So no one will punch you in the face.
Yeah, we've got all the classics here.
There we go. For streaming, I think it's fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah. Here it is. So if somebody says Heil PR40, now I can add all those in post. For me, like you mentioned, the Zoom PodTrack P4 does everything the Rodecaster does without the processing, which you can add in later with a $40 plugin. So,
but is that what you do your processing after the fact? Like you didn't a lot so DBX 286S. So for podcasting, I run through that, but when I'm doing an audiobook, I just go naked raw track straight into the.
Right.
I want more flexibility. And I think you use Shep's Omni channel.
Yeah. Yeah.
So.
It's fine. I use that. So I have processing on now because I have a noise gate because my air conditioning is going to pop on.
That helps.
And I do a little bit, but I don't. Processing is one of those things where, I remember when I first got the Rodecaster Pro 1, and I found the big bottom button and turned that thing up to 11. And people are like, you're jarring my fillings out of my teeth with the bass. Can you kind of, back it down a bit? Yeah. So you can, I found a little bit will get you where you need to go and you don't have to go.
I think a lot of new podcasters, it's almost like, Dave, when I started playing guitar, were you this way? Where you just crank the reverb? You're like, man, it sounds so good. And it sounds like you're in like a Grand Canyon.
A cave. Yeah.
Yeah. Or the distortion, you just turned up to 10. And I think a lot of podcasters do that with the FM radio. They love to get close to the mic and they love to, it's like,
yeah,
I get it. It's almost like an Instagram filter though, that sometimes like we go, I've seen people with Instagram filters, like literally on CNN, and it's like, woo, airbrushed. Looks like Kim Kardashian or something all of a sudden. It's like, dude, you don't look like that. Sometimes I think people have to get used to their own voice and then,
absolutely.
So I'd say, no, it's not worth the money. I would look at other things. It's not bad,
Dave,
but it's not,
Yeah, Dave says there's an app called Backpack Studio. Yep, you can. So you basically get the Vocaster from Focusrite. Plug your phone in. There's your smart pads. You're not going to be able to make a phone call now, but you could do that. And you've got the 70 dB of gain. You've got they have the thing where you can add a little bit of processing to it. And I just heard Dan from Focusrite on another show, and they're going to make that much more customizable in the future. So if you want to add a little more bass instead of just having a preset, you'll kind of be able to make your own. But it's funny because I bought the Rodecaster 2 because I'm the guy from the School of Podcasting, and I knew people were going to ask questions about it. But if I wasn't,
give you one, Dave.
They did on the first one. I don't know I don't know who I upset over that I didn't get a second one. Maybe they're like, look, one's enough. Like, buy your own, kid.
Well, there's ethics involved though, right? When you get something for free, you're going to talk about it a little bit differently. So
a little bit.
Like I sent my Vocaster back.
Yeah,
that's usually the deal with any kind of equipment. Usually.
Well, I know something we could talk about here because we've got about another 20 minutes. And you had asked this question. So this is a Dave Hooper question. I was playing with Buzzsprout ads, and this is not a Buzzsprout thing. And it dawned on me because I did this whole thing where I was sending people to a page where people could subscribe. And I went in and looked, and I didn't really get any subscribers. I didn't really see any increase in downloads. So it wasn't a complete waste of money, but it was pretty close to it. And again, that's not a crack on Buzzsprout. It was a crack on my ad. And Dave's like, "Oh, can we hear the ad?" And I never put that out there. So
you have it on a sound pad, I hope, right?
And I have it on a sound pad. So this was. So I'm working on Buzzsprout ads. I'm like, oh, I want to play with this. It's new. It's fun. It's shiny. But I need an ad. Okay, so I grabbed my theme music and I said this.
The School of Podcasting with Dave Jackson.
Schoolofpodcasting.com/subscribe is where you're going to find me, Dave Jackson, a 17-year podcast veteran and member of the Podcasters Hall of Fame, sharing insights on how to plan, launch, and grow your podcast. If you're looking to monetize your show, yep, we hit on that too. It's all there, schoolofpodcasting.com/subscribe, schoolofpodcasting.com/subscribe. Thanks for listening. Now back to your episode. That was it.
You don't know what I would do?
Yeah.
By the way, it should be noted for you guys not on video that Dave fell asleep to his own commercial. I had to wait. I had to arouse him. I was like, whoa, not arouse him.
It's over, Dave. You can wake up. Yeah.
Whoa. Yeah. So shake him. It was kind of an afterthought. You're like, oh, by the way, if you want to monetize, we can help you with that.
Yeah.
I would have probably led with that. I'd say, look, broke ass podcaster, you want to make money for all this work that you're doing, pay for that Rodecaster too. Well, let me tell you how to do it. schoolofpodcasting.com/subscribe. I'm Dave Jackson. I've been doing this for 17 years, so I know a little bit something about this. Make sure, whatever, and give them the call to action. But I think that would be the real pain point. I love the jingle, though. That's actually how I sold Music Business Radio. That's the story behind that. And that I took a jingle and I gave it to the program director, and he had it in his mind's eye, like, oh, this is like old school radio. And sometimes I think music can really put you in the moment of getting somebody, it can break the monotony of whatever show that you're going to be on. Because Buzzsprout, if I'm right about this, do you pick where they put your ads? Or
no, what happens is you say, here's my show, and you type in the name of your show, and I believe they're looking up in Apple. And so Apple says, oh, Dave's in the business category and technology. And so that's what so if you want to be in a different category, you better change it in your feed first. And so you're like, okay, here's my money. And it's like, okay, we're going to submit this to people. And they I think by the end there were, I don't know how many shows, but you can see where, you had, I think it was 5,000 downloads, and like, hey, you're 14% through your thing. And here are the shows that, and what I told them,
they did tell you the show though, Dave.
Yeah. What's weird is
after the fact.
Yeah. After the fact. And what I told them, what I was kind of bummed about is when when it's over, when you've gone through your 5,000 downloads, you can't see those shows. And I kind of maybe see why, because it would be really easy for me to then approach them directly and cut Buzzsprout out.
Oh God. But dude, so how much PM are you paying for that? Do you know?
It was $20 per 5,000. Oh, see, I need to, I forget.
So it's $20 for 10,000. That's like what? That's $2 CPM. Is that right?
Yeah, it's here we go. I'm on their page here. Let me share my screen. It says if you go to buzzsprout.com/ads, that will get you there. Why can I not get back to the screen before? I'm hitting the back button. Okay, that's confusing. Here we go. 5,000 downloads for $100. So it's $20 CPM.
I mean, I don't like not having control over where my ads go.
Yeah, that was my whole thing. And I get, because the podcaster gets to say yes or not. If they want me, I was hoping to get okay, yes, I want my show there, because some of them were great. Like it was on the Buzz. See, this is my ad is finished. I was on 22 different podcasts, but I don't know who it was, and you can see where I was in the business, marketing, and technology. And you can pick if you're trying to target different sexes and things of this nature.
This seems to me like something that's really sexy, and it seems like an easy one-click solution for them to sell to people, and they can sell it to both ends of it. Like, hey, make money with your podcast. Remember those Anchor ads? Like Anchor we'll give you a sponsor that only ended up being Anchor. And I mean, there's some things that just don't work. And I think it's because you can't bring in stories, and you can't bring in connection, and you can't bring in, and we can really go down this. If you want me to give you something controversial, I can give you something right now. Okay. This is something sort of related. So you tell me if you think that I'm hijacking this, but there was something that just came out, this podcast Voices Help or whatever this is, about doing a pre-roll for Roe versus Wade. And as I mentioned, I'm Southern guy, liberal guy. I'm 100% for that. The problem is that it's not connecting the listener to you as a person. It's you reading somebody else's script. Yeah. And it's like, please, we need to get healthcare for people. It's a hostage video again. It's going to be so much more effective if you actually want to make change in the world for you to tell somebody your story. Hey, when I was 16, I got a girl pregnant and we didn't know what we were going to do. It was really scary because I'm a sophomore in high school making $3.35, asking, scooping ice cream, Baskin Robbins, and I had no skills. I didn't, you know what I mean? That's a story that's going to immediately get you in. You're like, oh, what happened? What happened? This is why I think we need healthcare. That's so much more powerful. And the same thing for your ad, and the same thing for any kind of connection that you've got with somebody. Like just having a random ad. I would pay you, Dave. I'm going to pay you more than $20 to get 1,000 people because I'm like, I want the endorsement from you. I want you talking about me. I don't want to just talk about myself. I think there's so much more powerful ways for you to do advertising than a random spray or pray on the business category. Like what's in there? What I don't know if it's what is it? Is it like, hey, Patriots, here's how to stock up food and make sure that you don't run out of business when the nuclear holocaust comes. I mean, it's like,
yeah, you never know who you're.
Dude, yeah, you don't want to have those kind of associations unless it's something that connects with you.
Well, and that brings up the whole fun thing. If you hear, I just listened to Podcasting 2.0 with Adam Curry, and a lot of times that stuff is way over my head because they're digging into the code and all sorts of stuff.
Yeah.
But he did one on networks, and he goes, look, I'm here to tell you, he goes, I'm not saying it can't be done. I'm here to say that they spent, I think he said $60,000 trying to advertise on Mevio and Podshow. And he goes, for it to work, everybody has to make super safe shows, and super safe shows are to get Glenn back in the game.
Don't be boring.
They're boring, and he goes, so
advertising changes you.
Yeah. And so he was like, he goes, that's why you can't monetize a network. He goes, you might be able to if it's all the same topic. And he goes, but for the record, he goes, advertisers are looking for brand safe, and brand safe is boring. And I was like, well, there's a guy that's got some insight. So we'll see.
Well, okay. So yeah, this is the reason that if we're going to let's just dive into here, Elon Musk, if Elon Musk had just let Twitter just be like whatever it was going to be, just like, it's a free for all, man, free speech. Look, free speech does not work for advertising because it turns into 4chan. Nobody's going to, go to Pornhub and see who's advertising on Pornhub. You just get more of it. Right. And that's just God's honest truth to it. It's just like you get the.
It's not what I'm going to be sharing my screen on. Let's see what happens. No.
Yeah, go to Pornhub. Go to Porn. Yeah, I've got this funny meme called PodHub. By the way, this is a side note.
Okay.
It said RE20 gets drunk and does a podcast without a pop filter. It's got PodHub. Thank you. That's where I came in. Anyway, but nobody wants to. You don't want association like that. And I think we're really concerned with association right now because people can say the wrong thing. I mean, even by me coming out, talking about that Pod Voices thing, it's not like it's a bad thing, but that's probably going to make somebody mad. What are you talking about? You're not, no. I'm telling you to share your story about it. Don't just read a random hostage message. Let's bring our personalities into it and let's connect with people that are like us so we can attract people that are like us because we're not for everybody. And the random spray and pray, I'd love to be able to press a button, boop, bring me more sales. Boop, make this video go viral. Boop, make me have an FM radio voice and be great on camera. But it doesn't work like that.
Yeah. Well, and you put your $20 for 1,000 downloads. And again, that's kind of in the ballpark for CPM right now. But the question is.
Not for me, though. I mean, I don't know what you're getting for CPM, but I get $200 for CPM on my podcast.
Per CPM? That's awesome.
Yeah. Well, that's because I do a deal differently. And we can talk about how I do that. But when you come to me, you're getting an endorsement from me. You're buying me. You're not only getting me reading your ad, but you have the use for that ad. If you want to use it in your advertising, it ends up being about $200 CPM.
Nice.
But that's why you're charging for the wrong thing. I mean, don't neglect the value that you've got. Take it back to Zeta Christian. Zeta Christian's got a podcast called My Spouse Has Dementia. She's a woman who's been through it. She's telling heartfelt stories. If you've got some kind of care program, some kind of, I don't know what it would be, some kind of something to help people in that situation, you want Zeta, reading your ad. You don't want me coming in, hello everyone, not being like, my name is David, I'm a podcaster, but I'm here to talk to you about dementia. You don't want that. You want her reading, and they're going to pay more for her.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, it'll be. I just worry because and you've got the radio background. There's a great movie. It's a documentary on Amazon called Corporate.fm.
Yeah.
And they show how everything was consolidated.
Yeah.
And when things get consolidated, you get less choices, you get less options. I know this week
it's not local anymore. Like when I was growing up, and look, I'm still in the same neighborhood more or less that I grew up in. It's a gentrified neighborhood though. My parents had a $35,000 house when I was growing up in the 70s. Down the street was a guy who owned the radio station. He lived in a similarly priced house. He owned a radio station. That would not happen today. The FCC certificate that lets my station broadcast is worth $20 million last time I checked, and that was probably 10 years ago. That's the certificate. That's a piece of paper for you to have a license to broadcast. That's how much money it costs. So yeah, it's totally changed. Can't happen.
Jeez.
Yeah. Ridiculous, right?
And so when I see everybody going, oh, the next thing that we need is more ads, I'm like, I'm not quite sure that's what's going to save. Not that podcasting needs saved in the first place. I just worry that as we make it easier and easier to add ads to podcasts, that we're just going to, right now, there's a bunch of stuff going on in Cleveland with our football team. And I'm not a big sports guy, but I'm just dying to hear what's going to happen. Because we hired a quarterback, paid him more money than anybody in football. And when we hired him, he had 24 cases against him for inappropriate. Let's just say this: he has a really bad back because he goes to massage parlors on a regular basis, and And so I'm dying to hear what's going to happen to this guy. So I will walk into my kitchen. I will ask the woman in the tube from Amazon to play the local sports station to see what's up. And I'm here to tell you, 9 times out of 10, it's an ad for Shady Rays. And right now I hate Shady Rays because it's a Shady Rays commercial. And I almost thought for a second that they had it programmed that if you used your smart speaker, it would play an ad first. That's not happening. It's just that every time I turn on the radio, it's an ad. And I was like, and it's many times, many minutes of ads. And I was like, I don't want this to be podcasting. I understand that
it's remnant space. And I think it's a race to the bottom. Like I know guys that literally have 5 or 6 ads. I'm like, dude, that's a lot of ads. He goes, yeah, well, I figured that they did the math on it. It's like it doesn't make me lose an audience to put another ad in there, and I'm making $1,000 per ad, so I might as well do it. And we've seen this like Tim Ferriss does this, and Gary Vee and all these guys, and they throw a ton of ads because people skip them, so that makes the value even less. But the way to do it is going to be branded podcasts. But I agree with you, like people want local. And especially now with the internet, and I'm not ever going to find anybody who's really engaged in Cleveland who grew up there and who knows about, never winning or whatever, the tomahawk chop and that kind of whole controversy. I mean, you want to have a local in there who knows, like insiders, not just Jack FM or something.
There's this guy named Kenny Maine, I think it's his name, and they say like I'm supposed to know who Kenny Maine is.
M-A-N-E.
I think, and he's like, Kenny's got a new podcast on Odyssey, and he was there to promote it, and he's like, well, we're going to be talking sports, and somebody kind of asked him like, well, what's going to be different about the podcast, and his answer was going to be, it's longer interviews.
Well, that's one difference.
And I was like,
it's going deeper.
It was just interesting that. Like, here's a guy, he knew he was coming on to talk about his podcast. And I was just like, wow, somebody needs to give Kenny some media training.
That's the best you can do. Yeah.
I was like, your answer was, well, it's longer. And then he's not going to be, it's going to be talking sports, but also like today he interviewed Christopher Guest from Spinal Tap. And I was like, okay, so it's not just, it was just weird to hear.
Well, so let's talk about because I know that we're running out of time here, but let's talk about the opportunities. One, it's going to be the branded podcasts that are really hyper local or hyper niched out. The opportunity for people like you and me is not only there, but the fact that we can do long form content, because you got these kids coming up and they're great for a 30-second TikTok, but at 31 seconds, it's like, you lost me.
I'm out.
Yeah. But so it's not everybody. People say, well, not as many people. I got 1 billion views on my TikTok. It's like, well, hell, they watched 50,000 videos in the last hour. And that's how you're getting 1 billion views. Nobody's sticking around. The opportunity is long form content. It's hyper niche content. It's hyper local content. Local. I know you've done this with like a local Akron podcast. I had a podcast just from my neighborhood and started testing these things out. Yeah, man, because I wanted to try it out, but it was great. I mean, we had complete penetration of the neighborhood, and I don't remember the exact numbers now, but it was the kind of thing like if you're a local coffee shop, are you going to pay me that $200, $300 CPM, or are you going to go pay $20 on Buzzsprout? Think about that. And for a local 5-minute podcast, it just tells you, hey, there's traffic on 10th Avenue today, or whatever. There's construction. Be safe. And this house is for sale from a local realtor. If you want to own a neighborhood, that's the way to do it. Not going to Buzzsprout.
I had a guy that he was in Facebook, and originally he said he was going to start a podcast about his bowling league. And I was kind of like, ugh, really? Because I'm picturing that guy then turning around and going, how can I make money with this? But on the other hand, if you look at that as a hyper local podcast and you interviewed all the people on the other teams, you'd end up with this cool little baby community. And you might actually get some free bowling out of it.
It's a hyper niche, but I'll tell you, though, bowling is the #1 participatory sport in the United States. Did you know this?
I did not know that.
And I'll tell you why. It's because a guy can go in there and eat fried cheese and smoke cigarettes and still be an athlete. People love bowling. You're not going to see them because they're always in bowling leagues. But, that's a niche in a number of ways. And something like AMF and corporate bowling and all these other type plays. I mean, there's a lot of money in bowling, and you could definitely, and they're probably pretty easy to get to, I would think. Just go down to the local league and just stick a mic in front of their face.
That's it.
I don't know about just your team. Just your team has its own podcast, but maybe. I mean, they're
I can see doing the league. Yeah.
Well, you're in Akron, right? Because it's colder there, so bowling is going to be more popular in places like where you are than where I am.
Yeah, absolutely. So
good old Southerners, we're out, outside and stuff.
Riding your bike.
We shoot the pins. We don't have a ball. We just
take them out back. Target practice.
Yeah, we use it as target practice down here.
Excellent. Well, Mr. Hooper, thank you so much for keeping the chair warm there for Jim. Jim, as far as I know, we'll be back next week. We'll tune in next week to find out. But find Dave over at bigpodcast.com. Go to Amazon, type in David Hooper, and check out all of his books. They're all great.
Yeah, that book is 99 cents now. And if you do get it, I'd appreciate a review, by the way. Authors, same thing as podcasters. That helps us a lot. And
in that case, it actually does help you get found. I think
it's the social proof and just ego, and that we'll say that. Let's call it that, ego. I can't let Dave Jackson have more reviews than me.
There you go. But thanks again to our awesome supporters. Go to askthepodcastcoach.com/support. Check out Mark at podcastbranding.co and Dan at basedonatruestorypodcast.com and James at the Dog Podcast Network. We are here every Saturday morning, 10:30 a.m. Eastern, to do Ask the Podcast Coach at askthepodcastcoach.com/live. And this is like live radio because I'm running out of things to say, and I need about another 10 seconds for this to get up so I can slide the music. I'm stretching it out, and we're almost to the point where I can slide up this fader. Here
David
it is.
Hooper in Nashville. It's David Jackson in Akron, Ohio. See you
next
time.
We're out.